Palestinian human rights organizations have been facing Israeli threats after pushing a case at the International Criminal Court. Death threats were recently made against rights activists who are seeking to hold the Israeli leaders accountable for atrocities committed against Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. Staff of Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, along with 3 other groups, have been facing a campaign of attacks. They accuse Israel of war crimes in the besieged Strip, mainly during the 50-day war in summer 2014.
Our members received death threats, especially those who were collecting evidence or preparing cases against the Israeli war criminals. A number of right organizations have received multiple threats. They include Al-Mizan, Al-Haq and others. Even a prosecutor of the International Court has received similar threats.
Palestine officially joined the ICC in April 2015 and immediately filed complaints with the court. Tel Aviv has rejected any responsibility for the war crimes and just recently cleared Israeli soldiers of killing Gazan civilians during the 2014 onslaught.
The whole judiciary system in Israel is a cover-up on war crimes committed by the Israeli army against Palestinian civilians and Palestinian property. So nothing new. We are not surprised by closure of investigations, dismissal of cases, by the conclusions that no war crimes committed. This is what has been expected.
Israel's wanton attacks in 2014 included the bombardment of civilian populated areas, the UN buildings, and other structures protected by the Geneva Convention. Such attacks have been the pattern of the previous Israeli offensives against the Gaza Strip. During the 50-day war alone, Israeli forces killed nearly 500 Gazan children alone. But despite this, it has not taken responsibility for its vicious attacks against civilians. Ashraf Shanan, Press TV.
We have just received word from the French Minister of the Interior that Diana, the Princess of Wales, has just died.
This week in history, 1997, the world lost its most popular princess. A car crash in a Paris underpass took the life of Diana, the Princess of Wales, her companion Dodi Fayed, and their driver. Circumstances surrounding the crash remain a subject of debate and conspiracy theories to this day.
We are calling for a non-violent, peaceful march on Washington.
This week in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King, fed up with discrimination and violence against African Americans, organized a march for jobs in Washington, D.C. 250,000 people showed up, including Bob Dylan, who performed with Joan Baez. It was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that day that Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
I accept your nomination for President of the United States.
This week in 2012, Mitt Romney officially became the Republican nominee for president at his party's convention in Tampa, Florida. Hurricane Isaac was bearing down on the city as the convention opened, putting a hold on activities for day one. The convention also featured a bizarre monologue delivered by Clint Eastwood to an empty chair.
What do you want me to tell Romney? I can't tell him to do that. Can't do that to himself.
This week in 1969, Bob Dylan made his first public appearance in more than 3 years at the Isle of Wight Music Festival in Wootton, England. Dylan had gone reclusive after his nearly fatal motorcycle accident in 1966. His return to the stage brought out a huge audience that included the likes of Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr. With This Week in History, I'm Jonathan Carl.
The Dheisheh refugee camp near the city of Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank has been the scene of constant raids by the Israeli military forces since its establishment in 1949. But the recent attacks had a twist. They involved targeting the knees of Palestinian youth and children in the camp. The campaign was authorized by an infamous Israeli intelligence officer.
We are facing a violent and systematic campaign launched by an Israeli intelligence officer. He promised to make tens, if not hundreds, of the camp's youth use crutches forever. In other words, to make them disabled. Then we noticed that in about a week, there were more than 17 cases of injuries in the kneecaps.
Nidal Obeid is one among many Palestinians who was shot in his leg for no reason.
I was passing by when I heard that some people were injured by the Israeli forces. When I arrived at that point, a sniper from one of the rooftops fired at me with a fragmenting bullet. This bullet hits the body and then fragments leave nothing from your flesh. Of course, the other injured youth were also shot in their knees.
Around 80 Palestinians with injuries in their legs now live in this camp. The injuries had been critical and almost difficult to cure. Even after receiving these injuries, the Israeli intelligence officers call the victims and threaten them with further arrests or injuries to their family members if they dare talk to the media. Atrocities committed by the Israeli forces, including shooting and maiming Palestinians, have left a generation of minors who need crutches to walk. Observers say the lack of international interference has led the Israeli troops to continue destroying the lives of these children. Hamad Hamail for Press TV, the occupied Dheisheh refugee camp.
James Jatras, former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, live out of Washington. Mr. Jatras, thank you so much for being with us. So, given how the people of Kobani, the Kurdish populated city in North Syria, drove out Daesh terrorists last year, what fate do you think will be awaiting Turkish troops if they enter the city?
At first, it depends on what the Turkish intentions are. The offensive the Turks have launched is directed against, they say, both Daesh and against the Kurds. But it's clear that the Kurds are the primary objective of the offensive. Now, the immediate objective, as you mentioned, was the capture of the town of Jarablus, which the Turks are concerned that the Kurds not expand their zone to the west of the Euphrates River. That seems to have already been accomplished. Now, the question is how deeply do the Turks want to get dug in to northern Syria? And I think that's unclear. I think it would be a big mistake if they tried to basically stamp out the so-called Rojava area that the Kurds have carved out, but they may go too far.
Yes, and indeed the Kurdish people of Kobani have made it quite clear that they are opposed to any Turkish action in their city.
That's right, and I'm sure that they will fight ferociously if the Turks attempt to seize it. But we don't yet know what their intentions are. You know, the larger question, of course, is with whom are the Turks coordinating on this? Let's remember that the Kurds have been among the strongest elements that the Americans have supported in this war, and it seems that we are acquiescing to they're being hit by our formal ally, a Turkish ally, who is a NATO member. It also seems that many people are speculating that this move of the Turks was coordinated with the Russians and the Iranians, and even with the Syrian government, which has issued what seems to be mainly a pro forma objection to their incursion.
Mr. Jatras, it seems that Turkey is not wanted in Syria. The government in Damascus says Turkey's intervention is a breach of its national sovereignty. And we had the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying yesterday in his press conference with John Kerry that there are certain countries that are undermining the government of President Bashar al-Assad by their unwanted military intervention in Syria. Is Turkey really helping in the fight against Daesh with its apparently unwanted intervention in Syria?
I think its actions against Daesh are quite negligible, actually. It's clear that the Kurds are their main problem inside Syria. As far as the attitude of the Syrian government goes, again, they have objected to this, but it seems to me that it is more pro forma. There have been some very sharp clashes recently between the Kurds and the Syrian army. The Syrian army doesn't mind the Kurds fighting against Daesh, but they also don't want to see the territorial integrity of Syria diminished by what amounts to an independent Kurdish entity.
So Turkey is actually following its own interests by taking its troops inside Syria and launching attacks?
It is, of course, you would expect them to do that, and we'll have to see how extensive they intend this operation to be. If they limit themselves to trying to blunt the extent of a Kurdish entity and don't get dug in further than that, and are then willing to accede to Damascus's reassertion of control against the other terrorist groups operating against it, we could be seeing a decisive shift in this war. We just don't know yet at this point.
James Jatras, former U.S. Senate Foreign Policy Analyst, thank you so much for your time and for talking to Press TV.